All good there. For next week, there is actually no seminar, so you can show up, but there won't be anything here. And then the following week, there will be a seminar, and that's Jesse Bell from the University of Nebraska Medical Center, who will be talking about Nebraska health, water, and climate. Yeah, and then I think that's it. I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Shawn. So I'll go with one of my usual lengthy introductions. So this is Shawn Crimmins. He's the assistant unit leader of wildlife at the Nebraska Cooperative. Oh no, not Nebraska. You're Alaska. It rhymes, so I have a little bit. Alaska Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So talking about some of his research on moose.
Can you guys hear me? Hello? It's working at all? Yeah, okay. We'll figure it out. So thanks everybody for showing up. I apologize for not being a little more presentable. My luggage got lost in the ether of American Airlines. So I bought a new shirt. I'm pandering to the audience, SNR Graduate Student Association. So I'm part of the team now. So when Sarah invited me to give this seminar, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to talk about. And so I decided to kind of do a little mishmash of stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of projects that some of my grad students have been working on in Alaska, and then kind of transition into what might be more of a, we'll just say a discussion that might have a little bit of ethical things dabbled into it about ungulate management in Alaska, and kind of highlighting how some of the research we do either does or does not contribute directly to some of the management decisions that get made. So hunting in Alaska. Now, we're all natural resources folks. We're very well aware of how important hunting is, but I would make an argument that Alaska is very unique, and to the degree that hunting is critical. The guided hunting industry in Alaska, which is a pretty big deal, generates about $90 million a year in revenue, which is a pretty big chunk of money to a state that's largely rural, largely kind of on the lower end of the economic spectrum. Licensed revenue sales for fish and game run anywhere from 10 to 15 million bucks a year. And of course, that's the revenue that is then used to get PR funding, which funds most of the actual on the ground management in the state. And it's estimated that like 2,700 jobs and over $1 billion in overall economic impact and revenue is generated through hunting in Alaska. Now that's a lot of money anywhere, but that's especially a lot of money in a state that doesn't have a whole lot of other mechanisms for generating revenue. We don't have sales tax in Alaska. We don't have income tax. We have very limited resources that we can use to actually generate revenue, and hunting is one of the ones where we can actually bring in funding from elsewhere. But perhaps more important than just the money aspect is that in Alaska specifically, we as a whole rely on wild game and wild food. So this is results from a study that Alaska Department of Fish and Game did about 10 years ago, where they were trying to quantify the total amount, and not just in straight up pounds of food from various wild food sources that different communities in different areas of Alaska use. And in some cases, like urban areas, which is mostly Anchorage, it's not a ton, 10 pounds of stuff a year, which could be berries, fish, birds, mammals, whatever it might be that we're harvesting. But you start getting into some of these regions in like interior and western Alaska, and these are communities where on average people are sustaining themselves on a couple 100 pounds of wild game a year. And especially in the western Arctic and interior regions, a lot of that comes from large mammals. So basically moose and caribou, anywhere from 50 to 100 pounds a year of food on average is provided to these communities by subsistence harvest. So there's an economic impact of hunting in Alaska, but more so than any other state, the true subsistence value of these resources is critical. There are literally communities that survive on wild game. So we have this kind of dual structure where we really pay attention to both the economic impacts and these literal human health impacts. And this is one of the biggest things in Alaska right now, is focusing on food security. And that actually ends up becoming a pretty important aspect of wild game management. Oh, please tell me it didn't freeze. There we go. So a little bit of some of the issues surrounding ungulate management and monitoring kind of everything about the kind of legal fish and game into things when it comes to ungulates. And so we have some unique challenges when it comes to trying to monitor and manage and do anything with ungulates in Alaska. And it's largely based upon the scale and accessibility, right? Alaska's big, you're probably aware of that, but most of the state is, from the grand scheme of things, what we would call in the lower 48, almost like entirely inaccessible. So there's about 36,000 miles of roads in Alaska. And that sounds like a lot, it's a big number. That includes all the roads in the city of Anchorage, which has about 300,000 people. And to put that number in context, Nebraska, according to the Department of Transportation, has got about 5 times as many miles of roads. And Nebraska is about 1/6 the size of Alaska. So you guys have 5 times as many roads that are spread out across 1/5, 1/6 the area. So it's not hard to imagine that getting out into the field to survey populations, to conduct research on some of these ungulate species, and to develop management plans and actually implement those plans can be kind of tough. So moose specifically, moose are the most widespread ungulate in Alaska. They occur virtually everywhere, all the way up from the North Slope, this like Togiak National Wildlife Refuge up here, if you guys have heard of that, all the way down into Southeast Alaska, into temperate rainforest, and then out at the edge of the Bering Sea. This is a species that's remarkably well adapted to a wide variety of climates and biomes. Yet a lot of the management strategies and monitoring approaches that Fish and Game uses kind of takes a one-size-fits-all approach, where they try to use singular metrics that they apply to moose populations all the way across the state. And so it begs the question of, are all moose the same? This is kind of a leading question, obviously. Like I said, we've got moose in southeastern Alaska. So this is like the Pacific Northwest, the Togiak National Forest, temperate rainforest, where there's not a ton of forage production. There's a pretty unique and specific predator community. And so that's a particular landscape that has its own issues and its own unique challenges. Interior Alaska, like Denali National Park, right? Kind of what you might think of a more, for lack of a better term, like upland, quote unquote, habitat. Obviously, that's a completely different landscape where you have different plant systems, again, different predator guilds, and a different management structure. And then if we move all the way up into sort of the northern part of Alaska, where we don't have as much topography, we have these systems that are largely treeless. They focus mainly on shrubs and grasslands. So we have this one species that's living these wildly divergent ecosystems in this one state. And yet a lot of the management and monitoring tools we use and way we apply these pieces of information is kind of applied blankly, uniformly across every population. So just kind of setting the stage a little bit. So let's talk about one particular moose population. So I want to talk about, this is a grad project that my first grad student up there, Sebastian Zavoyko, finished up last year. So I want to give him credit where credit's due. So this is a project in Togiak National Wildlife Refuge. Now, I don't expect any of you know where that is. So here's Alaska, right? Alaska's big. This little peninsula down here in southwestern Alaska, this is where Togiak National Wildlife Refuge is. And if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that there's these different game management units and subunits within this area. And just again, to give you an idea of scale, this entire refuge is essentially roadless and it's 4.1 million acres. It's almost twice the size of Yellowstone, and there's essentially no roads in it. Yet there is harvest. There's a lot of local communities that exist and live within the bounds of the wildlife refuge, and so they actually engage in subsistence harvest. So this is a pretty unique system, right? We don't often think about having essentially 4 million acres of roadless area where we're actually dealing with harvest and harvest management. But this is a pretty unique population. Sorry, I'm admitting people in Zoom right now. Okay, thanks. So this is a pretty unique area and a pretty unique population. And one thing that makes this particular area unique is what's been going on with this moose population over the decades. So in around 1990, sort of the turn of the decade, when it was first when the Fish and Wildlife Service started paying attention to how many moose there were. At the time, there were only about a dozen in the whole refuge, again, 4 million acres. But over the years, in the last 30 years or so, it's increased to over 2,000 individuals. Like, it's a pretty massive change in population size, essentially, It's been variable, but roughly speaking, it's kind of been growing exponentially for a few decades. Now, what's been going on the landscape at the same time is there's been a large change over the decades in the vegetative communities, what we call in Alaska shrubification. The idea that we're starting to see increased woody plant growth in areas where typically there wasn't. So in other words, willows and things that moose like to browse upon are starting to grow more rapidly, and maybe that's a climate change signal, maybe it's not. And what's also been going on in this area is typically we are seeing warmer and wetter winters. So this is an area, this part of the state kind of I should say seasonally, year to year has kind of variability in how much sea ice there is, if at all. That can have huge impacts on winter weather conditions. And so what we got involved with this project, Fish and Wildlife Service said, hey, we've been collecting data on this moose population for like 20 odd years. Here's what we've got. So what they started doing in the late 90s was going out there, catching moose, flying around a helicopter, shoot them in the butt with a dart, hop out of the helicopter, put a radio collar on them. And started again in the 90s prior to kind of satellite telemetry technology. So they're using VHF collars. They do monthly telemetry flights for the duration of the lifetime of this animal. And they finally wrapped this up in like 2022. And what they do on these monthly flights is they check the status, like mortality status of every individual. And they try to get a visual observation of these animals and see if they could identify whether or not the cow, they only colored cows, whether or not she had a calf. And so this is kind of hard to see, but this is a cow moose right here. And that's a calf next to her. And that's actually twins. Kind of hard to tell. There's actually two calves there. And so what they said was, we have all this visual observation data from these telemetry flights that we've collected for 2 decades. We'd like to know something about survival rates, productivity, reproduction, calf survival. Can you tell us something about the population dynamics of this moose population so we can maybe understand what's been going on? What is the thing that seems to have been important for this population increasing exponentially? So what we did was make it not fun. We threw a bunch of math at it, did a big Bayesian multi-state model where we could take all these messy data and hopefully turn them into pieces of information that are actually useful. This isn't the fun part. Just had to show some equations. So what we found was very, very high cow survival rates, like 98%. So what was nice is when they implemented this monitoring program, they talked to the local communities and said, hey, we're going to be radio collaring cows. Can you actually not harvest cows? If you're going to go out there and harvest moose, can you please harvest bulls instead? And the communities agreed. They said, okay, we want to know what's going on as well. So we'll actually do that. So a very high, very stable adult survival rate. Calf survival rate is all over the place. Like some years, complete failure. Some years, every single calf died. Right? That's probably not a good thing. But you can see in some years, 85, 90% calf survival rate. So wildly variable all over the place. Parturition probability, what is the probability that a female is actually going to have a calf at all? Hovers around 50% and somewhat variable. And then an important aspect of moose population dynamics in Alaska that's a critical thing for monitoring is this, the probability of twinning. What's the probability that if a female is going to have calves, that she's going to have 2? Generally speaking, the thought is that if a lot of the cows that are reproducing are having twins, that's probably indicative of a good, healthy landscape, like no nutritional limitations. And it's pretty high, not terribly variable, and a relatively high twinning rate. And so we also then tried to relate some of this stuff to things related to the landscape. So we looked at how does calf survival, is it affected by things like vegetative growth? So we found a pretty positive relationship between calf survival and NDVI, basically a rough measure of how much biomass there is in the landscape during that calf's first summer. And a relatively weak but somewhat positive association between the probability that a female is going to have twins and what the vegetative growth was like the previous year. So again, kind of tying into that idea that twinning is probably somewhat related to the nutritional landscape. And then we also found some negative effects of winter severity. When winters are bad, it seems like calf survival is a little lower, not terribly surprising. And the probability of twinning is also related to how bad the winter was the previous year. So these are 2 things, winter severity and overall vegetative growth. that are probably kind of tied to sort of long-term climate change signals. We would expect that as the landscape is getting warmer, we have more ephemeral snowpack, winter severity is not as bad, and that's also going to lead to increased vegetative growth. So cool, we found stuff that's going on with this moose population. So we found high cow survival rates, which is not terribly surprising in a long-lived mammal. We found high twinning rates, which suggests that there's plenty of food out there, and kind of low-ish and super variable calf survival rates. And so if anyone's ever done population modeling, you'd look at that, just say, okay, it's a long-lived mammal. The most important thing must be cow survival, right? In long-lived mammals, small changes in adult female survival rates have massive changes on population growth. But if you've ever done matrix models, you've probably heard the term elasticity. That's basically what that's saying. How sensitive is population growth rate to changes in a certain demographic rate? So, well, we have actually wildly variable observed population growth rates in this population over that 20-odd years. Some years it was actually relatively stable. Some years it grew by like 15%. But cow survival was constant. So we wanted to know, well, what is the thing that's actually driving these observed changes in population size? So we do more nerdy math. We do a great big Bayesian integrated population model. We throw an approach at it called transient life table response analysis, which is just a fancy pants way of saying, if you have demographic information like survival rates and productivity rates across a long time series, and you also have corresponding observed changes in the population growth rate, you can actually partition how much of those observed changes in population growth are due to the observed changes in the demographic rates. And it turns out calf survival is the most important thing because it actually varied. So the years where we had almost no recruitment because of low calf survival rates, not surprisingly, the population didn't grow a whole lot those years. But years where we had very high calf survival rates, where almost all the individuals survived, we saw a massive uptick in population size the following year. So kind of sort of like a duh thing, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So keep that in mind. Calf survival is important when it comes to changes in ungulate population growth. So now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about more moose, but in a different part of the state, on the Seward Peninsula. So here we are in Alaska again. Remember, we were just down here, kind of southwest part of Alaska. The Seward Peninsula is several hundred miles north. You're probably not terribly familiar with this, but this is Nome, Alaska. That's where the Iditarod sled dog race ends. So just to give folks a little bit of a geography lesson for one thing you've maybe heard of in Alaska. So this is a landscape where there's very, very little woody vegetation, comparatively speaking. It's a landscape where, typically speaking, there is pretty consistent sea ice in the winter. So the winter conditions haven't been fluctuating as much as they have in southwestern Alaska. And so this is an area that's also subject to relatively high hunting pressure. Nome is a quote unquote large community for rural Alaska. It's like 3,000 people, which is a booming metropolis when you have to fly there because there's no road system to get you there. Nome right here has like 30 miles of roads that go north, 30 that go south, and 30 that go east, and then that's it. If you want to get anywhere else, you got to be on a snowmobile, which they call snow machines in Alaska because they don't know what snow machine really means. And or you have to fly. That's the only way to get around. You have still very high harvest pressure. And so this particular population has been subject to a lot of scrutiny when it comes from the public in terms of hunting access and accessibility. So in the late 80s, there were a series of really, really harsh winters consecutively, like 3 or 4 in a row, that just knocked the population down. It had been historically a fairly high density population. And now the population has declined from what it was historically in the mid 80s to about maybe like 1/3 the density that it used to be. So a pretty massive crash that's been sustained. Like this population hasn't recovered. There have been some pretty aggressive restrictions on harvest with the hopes of actually improving population growth. But essentially, the population has sustained itself at this really low density. And so the question is, well, why? Why hasn't this population rebounded? And so one of the first things you might think was like, well, that's near the Arctic Circle. You know, that's up there, that's north, like that's actually north of where they do the deadliest catch. So pretty harsh conditions. I bet there's not a lot of food. I bet these animals, they must be nutritionally limited. But one of the metrics that Fish and Game uses to actually determine whether or not a moose population is limited is what they call short yearling weight. Short yearling is a phrase I'd never heard until I moved to Alaska. It just means an individual that survived its first winter and is basically living its first spring, but hasn't gotten to that 1 year age, like 9 to 12 months of age. So the thought, and this is based on some work that's been done across the state, is that if a moose, a short yearling, if the average short yearling weight of a moose population is 175 kilograms, if it's above that, the population is not nutritionally limited. If it's below that, the population is nutritionally limited. So a single metric that's kind of being applied statewide. And so this particular population, this is again, northern Alaska, a pretty harsh landscape. And, basically we're talking about animals at this sort of demographic class. They're actually the heaviest that they've documented in Alaska. These are nice, big, fat, at least if they survive through the winter, their first winter, they're going to be fat. So the question is, well, we kind of came to this with the idea of, is this a metric that actually matters in terms of reproductive capacity or anything related to population growth? And if not, or even if so, what else might matter? And so just to kind of give you an idea of how these processes work and just show some fun videos, which will hopefully, it's a YouTube video, so we'll see. Oh, you can do it. Oh, that's a bummer. So imagine instead of this, a super cool professionally produced video of fish and game biologists flying around in a helicopter, dart gunning moose and jumping out and tackling them and then putting radio collars on them and wearing them these big tripods. I say, really not going to work. Yeah. Well, there's a second video here, which I know looks totally different than the first one. And the second video is Fish and Game folks with another professionally produced video doing aerial surveys on the Seward Peninsula, where it was a good example of kind of what the landscape looks like. So, and I actually kind of think it's somewhat analogous to some of the landscape in Nebraska, kind of rolling hills, not a ton of topography, but most of the woody vegetation is really limited to kind of these drainages, and the animals tend to congregate in these drainages. So it makes surveying these animals at least a little more feasible. And so what we wanted to do was go out there. So for 3 or 4 years now, they've been collaring these short yearling calves, weighing them, and then following them to see what their reproductive output was later on in life, with the idea that, again, if this short yearling weight is somehow indicative of nutritional status, that should then lead to some observable changes in population dynamics. And so this is a little hard to see here, but what this is 2-year-old parturition probability. What's the probability that a calf that we weighed as a short yearling is going to have a calf of her own that next year? And cohorts of 2018, 2019, and 2021, for 2 years, a very strong positive relationship between how much the calf weighed in her, basically her first spring, and what's the probability that she was going to have a calf the following year. Yet in 1 year, in the cohort of 2021, there was almost no relationship between how much those individuals weighed and whether or not they produced the following year. So not quite sure what this particular kind of blip on the radar was in terms of 2021's cohort, but on the whole, it looks like there's a positive relationship. An animal that's coming out of its first winter in better physical condition is more likely to have a calf that very next year. And if we look at age at primiparity here, so in other words, what age were these animals when they had their first calf based on how much they weighed as short yearlings, a pretty strong relationship. Animals that are heavier are more likely to have a calf there at age 2, as they're a little bit lighter at age 3. And then some animals don't even reproduce until they're 4 years of age if they're lighter. So that, you can imagine, that's probably pretty important if we start looking at basically 2 reproductive cycles that might be missed because of physical conditions. So cool, like this actually suggests that this metric of short yearling weight does somehow influence population dynamics. So again, on the whole, these are the biggest short yearling calves, short yearlings that Fish and Game's measured kind of anywhere in the state. So seems like it should be a pretty healthy population, right? And we have evidence that that relationship is important because it seems to affect population dynamics. So we have these calves that come out of that first winter, they're in good shape, and the better shape they're in, the more likely they are to reproduce. So what's going on? Like, they've already put harvest restrictions in place. Like, there's not a whole lot of harvest at this point because this population's at low density. So then the question is, well, all right, what is the reason this population hasn't rebounded? It doesn't look like it's nutrition. right? There's good physical condition. They've gone out there and done browse surveys, and they haven't found that the landscape appears to be overbrowsed. So we decided, okay, let's go collar some calves. Let's do the fun thing. And so for 3 years, collared about 60 calves per year. And ultimately, what we found was that calf survival rates in this population are really bad. And so this is from one particular year. This was, I think, the 2021 calf cohort. Out of 200 days post birth, survival rates under 25%, and there's still 165 days of life to go before it gets recruited into the population. So we've got really, really low calf survival rates in this population. Why might that be? Well, it turns out when you start flying around and investigating these sites for this past year in particular, almost all of those calves were killed by bears. Right, there is a very robust brown bear population out there on the Seward Peninsula. And so what we're seeing are cause-specific mortality rates like in the 70% range from bear predation. So, okay, we maybe have identified the culprit for why this particular population of moose hasn't really rebounded. So, and keep in mind from our other study just south of the Seward Peninsula, it really appears like variation in calf survival is the thing that's driving variation in population growth. So that then begs the question, okay, well, what can we do? What management options do we have access to in Alaska? And what can Fish and Game actually do to try to reverse some of these trends? So Fish and Game is legally mandated to try to essentially grow more ungulates to provide more subsistence harvest resources. Like they have to legally try to put more ungulates in the landscape. So, all right, let's kind of start small. What are some management options? Well, if you've dealt with white-tailed deer in the eastern or southern US, people are just like, food plots, that's the answer to growing more ungulates. You get these nice little 1/4 acre to 1 or 2 acre areas where you just plant some clover and it's great for white-tailed deer. And that is great for white-tailed deer. That doesn't really scale up to Alaska though. Right? We have relatively low densities of ungulates, whether it's caribou or moose. We don't have, it's not deer per square mile like in the Midwest, but it's more like square miles per ungulate in Alaska. So it's kind of hard to imagine that little 1/4 acre things, even if you could put them in and actually make them grow, it's probably not going to scale. Right? We have the average deer management unit in Nebraska is like 4,500 square miles. The average game management unit in Alaska is 26,000 square miles. So again, there is a literal scaling issue there. So that's probably not going to work. But what about something that we can maybe implement on a larger scale, something like timber harvest? Right? Obviously, a lot of these areas where we're working on these moose populations don't actually live in heavily timbered areas, but there's plenty of the state that is. And so, all right, maybe that's a habitat management strategy we could think about implementing to try to actually grow more ungulates. So the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, they have a wildlife habitat enhancement program, which is essentially their habitat management program for trying to grow more ungulates. They have 5 areas across the state where they're even trying to do anything. This is one of them. This is one of the more areas that's gone well. This is on the Kenai Peninsula. This is Homer, Alaska, right here on the south end. So if you've ever heard of that, kind of the halibut fishing capital of the world. This is literally something that they are promoting. Like, look, what a great job we did. We got 3 areas of timber harvest that collectively were like 110 acres. Is that bigger and better than putting food plots in? Maybe, but is that going to grow more moose at a landscape scale? Probably not. You know, this is a state critical habitat area, so it's one of the few areas where they can even try to do this kind of stuff. So, okay, timber harvest doesn't work. The next big thing you could think about in terms of habitat management would be like controlled burning, right? It's oftentimes, I didn't really even appreciate this till I went up to Alaska. Like, there's wildfires up there. Like, I assumed, well, it's, you know, the southeast Alaska, where you think of there being trees, it's a rainforest. There's no fires there. But 2 summers ago, we had 3.2 million acres burned in the state. Right? That's not a lot of the state, but that's a lot of ground. And so, all right, maybe controlled burning is a habitat management tool we could think about implementing at some larger scales so we could actually grow more ungulates. And so, as an example of this, so the Alphabet Hills is an area in central Alaska, like Denali National Park would be like way up here in the northwest. Wrangell St. Elias National Park is kind of on the southeast end of this. So it's like right in the middle in between the Alaska range and the Chugach range. And so this polygon here in the middle, this is a controlled burn that Fish and Game did in 2004. And they did it with the idea of kind of improving forage productivity for moose. And they decided, 15, 16 years later, they want to revisit that and see if they can do another controlled burn in the area adjacent to this. And so this is a big program. They want to do this burn. It's 53,000 acres. And that's a big controlled burn, I would argue, even in Alaska. If you actually zoom out, this is a dot on the map. But 53,000 acre controlled burn sounds big to me. Biggest one I've ever stood next to was 200 acres, and I thought it was insane. So 53,000 acres, right? This is the active website for this project. Notice the year. And that was the second or third year they'd been trying to do this. They have not gotten this burn to happen yet. They ran into issues with weather conditions. They ran into issues with take permits for bald eagles. There's a number of nesting bald eagles there. They ran into issues with permits from Bureau of Land Management. So for over half a decade, they've been trying to do this burn, this one big habitat management action, and they haven't been able to because of a variety of issues. So if you're Fish and Game, you're like, okay, habitat management just isn't really a thing. Like at large scales, especially when we start getting into central and northern Alaska, where there's not really trees to work with, and even fewer and fewer roads, what do? They've already tried to change harvest management strategies to see if they can recover some of these populations. And sometimes it works a little bit, sometimes it doesn't have a huge impact. Like some of these populations for things like migratory caribou, there might be a few thousand individuals that are harvested out of a population of 100,000. And so it's not a huge impact. And so what's the one thing you're left with? You can't change what the people are killing, or at least you can, but it might not impact it much. You can't change the landscape. You're left with the one thing that makes sense: predator control. It's called intensive management in Alaska. And this is a very easy sales pitch to make to the public. If I tell the public, hey, we've been collaring moose calves in the Seward Peninsula, and 70% of them get killed by bears. Well, gosh, if there weren't the bears eating the moose calves would still be alive and grow into big moose that people could shoot. It's a very logical sequence of events that you can pitch to the public. And so oftentimes there's a lot of support for the idea of intensive management in Alaska being a mechanism to grow more ungulates. But the question is, does it work? So what would you expect if predator control, we'll just kind of air quote that, worked in terms of being a management tool that's promoting more subsistence harvest? Well, what you would expect is that as more predators get removed, the resulting harvest, a couple years down the road of the ungulates should increase as well, because you've removed the predators, so there should be higher recruitment rates. And so if there's more recruitment, there's more moose and caribou out there, and so more moose and caribou should get shot, right? That's what you would expect to see. So last year, this paper came out by Sterling Miller, who's a retired fish and game biologist. A couple of other fish and game retired folks were on this project as well. And what they did is they took data, long-term data from one particular area in Alaska, Game Management Unit 13, which is the area where they were trying to do that controlled burn. And what they looked at, this is an area that's been subjected to intensive management for decades, like literally 25 years of essentially very, very, very liberal increases in wolf and bear harvest. And what they did is they looked at the number of wolves and bears that were taken out of this game management unit each year, and then how many moose were shot 1 year later, 2 years later, 3, 4, and 5 years later. Now, if it quote unquote worked, you would expect that these bars would be on the positive side. There'd be a correlation between the number of predators removed and the number of ungulates that were subsequently harvested. Right? That would be the logical thing you would expect to see if it worked. And most of the evidence that they present here suggests that it doesn't. Now, not surprisingly, this made a lot of people angry. There's definitely a lot of issues with the way this analysis was done, but this is the only published stuff out there about the efficacy of intensive management in Alaska. This is all we have to work on in terms of validating, quote unquote, whether or not this works. So that's maybe not a great place to be. So, all right, there's this one paper that says it quote unquote doesn't work. Do we listen? Nah, you don't want to listen. That's no fun. So this is Togiak National Wildlife Refuge down here, southwestern Alaska. This is also home to one of the 5 largest caribou herds in the state, the Mulchatna caribou herd. It's a very popular herd in terms of harvest, but it's a herd that was approximately, at least they think, about 200,000 individuals about 20 odd years ago. And today it's about 12,500. So if you are managing ungulate populations and you see this, you probably freak out, as you should, right? Because as a manager, you're responsible for making sure that there's enough caribou in the landscape to actually support subsistence harvest. So this area has had this population crash, it appears, for this caribou herd. And so what they do, Fish and Game, at the behest of the Board of Game, which is kind of the decision-making group for Fish and Game that goes through all the regulations every year, they decide to implement an intensive management program where they're going to go into this area, kind of in the central part of the Mulchatna herd's range, and focus on bear removal. So again, we were looking at moose down here, where we found a pretty large impact of calf survival on moose populations. And then adjacent to this, ironically, just east of it, Fish and Game was running a concurrent moose study where they've also found really low calf survival rates for moose there and really high bear predation rates. So, okay, I guess it stands to reason then that if moose have been a large predator of, or large mortality source for moose calves, they probably are for caribou calves. And they were doing a caribou calf study for this herd and found really low calf survival rates. But they also had very poor nutritional landscape. Like this population had been 200,000 animals and is now down to 12,000. That kind of sounds like density dependence, right? This is not a landscape where if the habitat has really been denuded from overgrazing, it takes a long time to recover. Right? It's not something that happens quickly. And there are now several diseases that are in this herd. So there's a lot of things going on. But this is, I mean, how do you manage a disease outbreak in an area with no roads and a migratory ungulate population? You can't. So this is something, this is a tool in the toolbelt they can actually do. So they implement this program. They kill 94 brown bears, 5 black bears, or sorry, 94 brown bears, 1 black bear, and 5 wolves over the course of a few weeks, aerial gunning. And so this was what they hope to find. They hope to be able to go out there and remove a large enough number of animals that it might actually have an appreciable impact on the caribou population. So I'd tell you guys that basically 100 grizzly bears got killed. What's your gut tell you? Like, are you like cool, or are you like, ooh? Ooh? Well, not surprisingly, this didn't go over well. When your management action makes it under the New York Times, that's not usually a good thing. And so this made the rounds, right? This was an authorized management program from the Alaska Board of Game. And so, not surprisingly, once word of this got around and the public got a hold of it, very, very bad public relations. They are currently facing at least 2 lawsuits over this, where the commissioners, the Board of Game themselves, are named as plaintiffs in these lawsuits. And this is a bad look, right? When you have a management action that you implement as a state management agency, and then you're getting sued over it. And granted, there's lawsuits all the time when it comes to wildlife management, but this particular one is starting from these opinion pieces that are very impassioned, very emotional, but it's understandable to think that people might not be terribly supportive of this, because this isn't intensive management in the sense that harvest regulations were loosened for bears, where people could shoot more bears. This was literally agency personnel flying around killing bears, and that's their job. They have to, right? They are legally obligated to do what the Board of Game says. So, intensive management, like predator control, is legally mandated in Alaska. They have to try to grow more ungulates for subsistence harvest, and they have to manage predators to do it. Ooh, legally mandated, that sounds like politics, right? Same thing in Wisconsin. Wisconsin has a legally mandated wolf harvest. And you might remember a couple years ago, Wisconsin got sued for having a spring wolf harvest season when they were actually out there having hunters in the landscape, killing wolves when the females were trying to go into dens. So 2 instances now of literally the legislature passing laws requiring the state wildlife management agency to do something. And in each case, they're getting sued for it. So I don't have a good bow to tie on this. Right? These litigation is currently happening. Like this is literally those lawsuits, like that was from August. Like this is not resolved because this just happened this year. And interestingly enough, that moose population I mentioned, they're now talking about implementing wolf control in that area. While there's these 2 active lawsuits going on. Again, because what other management tool can you implement at such a large scale? It's a tool in the toolbox. It's one that they have to do. So wildlife management's hard. Like it's hard enough as it is. Right? It's tough to go out there. And imagine you're in a landscape where you can even go collect good data. I mean, I kind of glossing over the fact that those caribou numbers for that caribou herd, that requires an aerial photo census that has a $1 million camera strapped to the bottom of an airplane. And they still only get those numbers every 3 or 4 years because the conditions have to be perfect, right? It's very, very hard to even get information on these landscapes. And then you got to translate that information into management strategies. So it's hard enough as it is, but when politics get involved, it's even harder because it doesn't really matter in some cases what the data and information say. If the biologist and the management agency are legally, legislatively mandated to do something, they're breaking the law if they don't do it. Right? That's a tough situation to be in as a biologist. Right? It's not one I want to be in. I work for the USGS. I can't make management decisions. I'm not allowed to. It's great. I can just give the science to the agencies and say, you guys figure it out. It's wonderful. But I know a lot of these biologists. The implementation of that bear control program for the Multnomah caribou herd, 2 biologists I know for Fish and Game quit over that. Right, 2 people that had master's degrees, they were research scientists, they literally quit over it because it was so political and they were catching such flack for it. But that's what they have to do. Like that's their job. So that sucks. And we like to think that wildlife management should be based on objective science. Like if you're familiar with the North American model of wildlife conservation, the last principle of that is that it's supposed to be science-based. Management's supposed to be based on sound science. It's hard to have sound science driving management when you have legal mandates that might be opposed to what the results of good, robust scientific work says. So with all that in mind, what you need to do, we all need to be, I think, advocates for science. I'm not saying we need to go to the state house in Juneau, Alaska, and petition the legislature to remove the intensive management mandate. That's never going to go well. But we as scientists, we as will be future, maybe current managers, we have to be advocates for science being the decision-making tool and not having it be politics. And so with that, here's some pictures of animals in Alaska. That's all I got. I said, I don't have a good bow for that. I just wanted to throw some information out there and let you guys stew over that for a while to think about how hard is management? And the answer, I think, at least in Alaska, is it's very hard. There's very, very good scientists doing very, very good work, and they're doing it in a very, very hard place to do it. So that's what I got. Any questions?
Thanks. Great talk, Shawn. We can do some questions and I'll check Zoom occasionally, but if we've got any questions from the audience, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for a great presentation. I want to know about the difference between the two sites you presented. Northern part of Alaska, there is a decrease of population of moose, but in southern part, there is an increase of population. And one of the major factors you talked about is 70% of moose are killed by bear. What is not happening in the southern part of Alaska? And bears is just the genetic makeup. What are the factors that make this moose to resist in those environments? The second question, have you thought about the genetic makeup of this moth? Thank you.
So I'm trying to get this screen to come back up because I scrolled and PowerPoint did not like that. Anyway, I was gonna try to bring the map of Alaska back up just to kind of provide some context, but yeah, so so both of these areas, there's a large predator population. There's a lot of bears, and so the predation impact is there regardless, and that's honestly ubiquitous across the state. But okay. Well, imagine, okay, here's Alaska. So we think the reason is that, so again, in the southwestern part of Alaska, we've seen this increase in the moose populations. But that is an area that has actually been way more subjected to the impacts of climate change. But, oh yeah, I guess we can do that. Thank you. I didn't even think of that. So if we were to, so here's the northern study area where we just had this low density moose population. Here's the southern study area where we've seen this increase. So like I said, this area is pretty consistent in terms of like winter sea ice. And so the landscape there hasn't changed much over the last 20 or 30 years. But here, this is at a low enough latitude, it's seeing pretty big impacts. And so winters are not as bad there anymore. The vegetation is, I mean, I think there's been some estimates that the amount of essentially woody browse in this landscape has increased by like several fold. So we think probably what's happening is the reason the moose population is increasing here is because this landscape is becoming more and more hospitable. It's turning into a really good area for moose. Interestingly, like the oral histories of folks in this area, like this is new. Like moose haven't always lived here, but up here there have always been moose. So it really seems like the expansion of the moose population down here is actually one of the few quote unquote good things that's coming from climate change. The landscape is there's just more forage in the landscape. And probably what's also happened is that, again, while this moose population has been increasing, that caribou herd crashed. And so I would suspect that if that caribou herd had maintained itself at a higher population size, we probably still have more predators in the landscape and we would have seen apparent competition. But right now, because the caribou population has crashed, there's not as many predators being drawn in that would probably predate the moose. So I suspect it's a combination of the landscape just getting better and having this sort of somewhat indirect competitor population declining by 90%.
Yeah, I'll ask a question. Actually, I'll make a comment and then ask a question. The comment is just I found it interesting the way you laid out the management options, and I would suspect that the Fish and Game Commission laid them out in the exact opposite order as you did, but that's just a guess. The question is, given what you saw with the short yearling nutritional condition and the high bear predation, your points about predator control and the political nature are well taken, but it seems like a good opportunity where predator control might work on the Seward Peninsula. Would you agree with that? Or
it might be. It's on the table. It's being discussed. And one of the things that if it gets implemented up here, I would suspect it'll actually be done in an experimental framework. And that's one of the issues is that there hasn't been anything done in Alaska yet in like an actual experimental design where they could truly see if they see resultant changes in demography that they would expect. And so I wouldn't be surprised if in a year or two they do implement bear control up here, but if they do it in a way where they could actually try to test whether or not it has an appreciable impact. Like I said, this is the area where they're kind of thinking about implementing wolf control, and they are debating. We've been trying to get a wolf study going there for about 2 years now, and finally got some collars in the landscape, and now those wolves are all probably going to die. So we might just give up on that. But they are continuing to monitor the Mulchatna caribou herd down here. They're maintaining probably 100 collars on adults, and they're trying to look at calf survival sort of post bear control. And so they are moving towards the idea of trying to see if they can figure out what is the metric, if it helps anything. You know, is it calf survival? And what we've what we suspect is that down here, that it's going to be almost completely compensatory mortality. You know, the nutritional landscape's just not good enough. But yeah, here it could be like there probably wouldn't be a resultant compensatory mechanism. So if it, I don't want to say if I hope it works or not, but if they do implement bear control up there in the Seward Peninsula, I hope that they at least measure the things they need to measure to see if it works.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you think about the work that was done in McGrath? We were talking about McGrath earlier. So the Keach 2011 work where they did in a quasi-experimental framework, you know, they removed all those bears non-lethally and basically shot the wolves, but they did document the increased survival of moose and moose calves. And do you think that's reasonable evidence, or?
I think it probably is, and I think it ties in better to up here, where if you're in a population where you don't have that nutritional limitation. So yeah, like right now, like I said, there's probably going to be bear control going on here. The paper that I mentioned that kind of didn't provide much evidence for support, that was down here. This is Unit 13, and so that's where, and that was a specific type of intensive management where they didn't go in there and remove bears and wolves. They simply liberalized harvest of bears and wolves primarily is what they did there. So it was more of a long-term increase in harvest of predators and not like a one-time aggressive approach to try to kind of get a huge chunk off the landscape at once. And so in that particular context where it's more of a long-term diluted thing, it didn't seem to work. But in situations where you might have a pretty good nutritional plane, it might work. But again, this is also the area where they've been trying to do controlled burns to increase the nutritional landscape because it's not great. And there's also a caribou herd here, one of the 5 biggest ones in the state, that's also essentially crashed in the last decade or two.
Right. Yeah. And I won't hog the mic too much longer, but yeah, I mean, I think that gets to your broader point that moose populations aren't all the same. And so taking into consideration the nutritional condition of the animals and whether you think compensatory mortality is at play, that should factor into those decisions, but maybe it doesn't.
But the amount of info you need to figure that out is a lot. And so getting even something as quote unquote simple as an adult survival rate for some ungulate population up here, you know, the scale of stuff here is just mind-boggling to me when I'd hear about a specific game management unit had a $200,000 monitoring budget for one species, and that's just their monitoring, which is going out there and putting 60 collars on stuff because they have to fly around everywhere to do it. It's just that the scale of it is kind of hard to wrap your head around, and then trying to translate that into the pieces of information you need to evaluate if predator control works it's a monumental task. Like my hat's off to the Fish and Game folks for even trying this stuff.
Any other questions?
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. And I really like examples, and we've had some in Nebraska here too, of kind of these political influences on management. So it seems like this kind of fits the narrative theme of kind of transitions of society over the last couple of decades from utilitarian to more mutualistic. And even, I think if I'm remembering a state by state analysis, that Alaska is still pretty utilitarian compared to other states in terms of like percentage of people. But then you can get hosed by a very influential newspaper in a state in the east that has high mutualist percentage.
Any particular newspaper you're referring to?
Well, the one that you showed, you know, New York. But I mean, that's kind of like our society today. And, you know, our colleagues of 70 years ago didn't have to worry as much about the influence of the New York Times on their work. You know, some people it might eventually get distributed to Alaska, but, you know, it'd take a little bit longer maybe. So I just wonder, so one of the things that I've seen here is that when our state agencies kind of didn't, I mean, I think they plan wisely. It's just like sometimes it's hard to see things coming. But then the next time they do a much better job or they're more conservative. And I just wondered if you've seen any examples in how this is like the state agencies learn to incorporate politics into their processes a little more, or their communication processes?
I'm going to editorialize a little bit. I'd say not a ton, honestly. So for example, Alaska is a very unique state in the way the decision-making process goes. So there's 5 wildlife management regions in the state, and every couple years they'll have a board of game meeting, and the board of game is 7 or 8 individuals that are appointed by the governor to basically direct these meetings, where any member of the public can submit a proposal to change harvest regulations for whatever they want somewhere in that region. So I tuned into the Region 4 meeting recently, which is basically like this part of the state, and there were like 360 proposals that they had, and the state has to address every one of them. And so usually that's the mechanism. So it's interesting because the public has this engagement, but this bear management plan, there was not, or this bear intensive management plan, there was not a proposal to do that. That was a unilateral decision by the Board of Game. And so I think that's part of the reason that there's been some pushback on this particular one within the state, is that it didn't follow kind of the traditional decision-making process. And if they're learning, I mean, they are subject to 2 lawsuits right now, but they're still pushing forward with at least another intensive management program for wolves. So it doesn't seem to be affecting the decision-making process yet. That said, these lawsuits, they're not emanating from Alaskans. I think if there was a lawsuit that came from the people of Alaska or some user group within the state, it probably would carry some more weight. But when something like Center for Biological Diversity or something like that's going to throw a lawsuit at Fish and Game, that's just simply not a group that they're going to put a lot of weight in. I mean, they'll do their due diligence in terms of the legal aspects, but so far, it doesn't seem like it's having much of an impact on the way day-to-day business and decision-making. But I think the first step though will be for them, if they are going to continue to implement intensive management, to do it in an experimental framework where they can then say, yes, this is the way, or this context in which it will or could work, rather than just saying, well, we're going to ignore the work that's been put out there that suggests it might not. But yeah, so far it hasn't really seemed to affect the day-to-day decision-making process. And I mean, the politics is interesting everywhere. The Board of Game, like I said, there's 7 or 8 individuals on it. I think 5 or 6 of them are guides. So it's certainly not a reflective group when it comes to the pot. Well, there's a button there, sorry. It's not a reflective group in terms of like the public of Alaska at large, but yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic that there's been enough negative feedback this time that down the road in the future, there might be a little more measured approach to this kind of stuff.
I had one more, and then if there's no others, we might wrap it up. But I was just curious because when I was working in McGrath, right in the unit next door, we were doing research, but they did a similar bear control effort to what you were talking about. And the original plan was just to go in and aerial gun bears and just let them lie.
Yeah.
And there was a bunch of outcry, particularly from their own agency biologists, saying, if you're going to kill all these bears, you got to get something out of it. And so they essentially sort of forced them to, 1, take biological data on the animals they killed, and 2, to distribute the meat to the local communities, which they ended up doing both. But I was just curious, in this one that you described more recently, did they take that into account, or did they just let them lie in the field?
I don't know if they took any biological samples. I would suspect they did, because that's pretty low effort. They did try to distribute some of the meat to the local villages, but from what I heard, it was not the majority of it. But I know they did make an effort ahead of time to distribute some of that. But the rumor mill now, is that, oh, they left a bunch of them to die, and they shot sows and left the cubs there to starve. And there's always going to be bad press. Whether or not any of that even happened, that's now what the rumor mill is. So they're already in a situation where they're trying to tamp down fires that might not even be real. But yeah, they did try to make an effort to distribute some of that meat. But it's a roadless landscape. Like you're flying around a helicopter, then all of a sudden you got to try to field dress a bear and throw it in the helicopter. Like it's not as easy as it sounds. It's just like, we'll just take the meat and donate it. So they definitely did, but I don't think they got all of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and that was actually the same deal. It was totally roadless, remote area where they did it, and they did it basically because of all the outcry, but it wasn't an easy process.
Yeah, but they did plan ahead of time to do a little bit of that, which might have been because of previous outcry. So yeah, maybe they do learn. It's not as quickly as you might want.
Well, let's give Shawn another round of applause and thanks a lot for coming.
Thanks for having me. Go ahead and end the Zoom. Yeah.